Alison Diamond is our speaker, and she's been the archivist at the I'm probably not going to pronounce this correctly, Inveraray Castle for 8 years, managing, preserving, and providing access to the collection and teaching secretary hand in her spare time. So we're glad to have her here, and I'll hand it over.
Thank you very much, Kate. That was lovely. Thank you. And you didn't do too badly on the pronunciation of Inverara either. You can actually say Inveraray or Inverara. Either is perfectly acceptable. Inverara is from the Gaelic, which is Inver and Era, which is the river, the mouth of the river. But most people do use Inveraray, and it has been largely an English-speaking place for quite a while now. Although there is at least one Gaelic speaker still living here. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in the programme. I really appreciate that. I'm just going to share my screen. So as Kate said, I've been archivist at Inveraray Castle for 8 years now. Before that, I worked for National Records of Scotland in Edinburgh. It's been lovely coming across here and being in charge of an archive, getting to make the decisions about what you want to do and how you want to do them, of which there have been very many decisions because it's largely uncatalogued still. So the whole process of organising, arranging and cataloguing is something that has given me lots of decisions to make, which is grand. But for this evening, I'm going to focus on the sort of ancestral perspective of the collection. So I'm going to give you a very quick overview of the whole archive, and then we're going to look at some of the main record series within it, and I'll try and focus on the types of information that you might find, particularly for the people related records. I couldn't possibly talk about the entire collection, so this sort of feels like a more useful way to approach it. And at the end, I'll just give you, there is one slide with some of our published archives. So most of them have not been published, but there are just a handful that have, and that should be readily available for you. So time for me to get going. And okay. So this is a picture of one of my archive stores. I add that I didn't furnish it. It was refurbished by the current Duke in around about 2009. He invested a lot of time and money in furnishing it. Sadly, it's not what an archivist would choose, but it does look very beautiful, and it does work. You know, the shelves can be moved, and it's got room for sort of big books and boxes and things. So it's not too bad, and because it has such a lovely look and feel to it, it's a great place to take cameras and visitors. You know, they're suitably impressed. So within this and the other two stores that I have, we've got approximately half a linear kilometre of records, which would be if you'd put them all out in a row, which of course you wouldn't. But you know, it's extensive, but it's not unmanageable, and it feels to me like during my career I should be able to bring order to chaos and end up with some sort of catalogue that will work. You may or may not have heard of Professor Alan McInnes. He's a historian in Scotland who's written widely on the West Highlands and the clans, and he did quite a lot of research in the archive back in the 1980s when the 12th Duke was still in charge. And he has said that the archive is particularly important for 3 reasons, and we're going to just have a quick look at those reasons before I start looking at the record series. So the first reason is the power and authority that the family held. So from the Battle of Bannockburn, they generally managed to pick the right side, or the winning side, whatever you like to call it, in affairs in Scotland. And of course, if you're on the winning side, then at the end of whatever's going on, the sovereign rewards you. And through that, the family gained land, and they gained positions and appointments, all of which, of course, have a financial element to them, as well as being the sort of positions of power. Many of these titles on the screen are actually still held by the Duke today, although nowadays they're really just titles and they don't come with any money and not much influence, really, to be absolutely honest. Some duties. You have to turn up and look important at certain events. So they were a very important family. They also owned a huge amount of land on the west side of Scotland. So on the right side there, you can see a very basic map of Argyll and the islands off the coast. And most of that area shaded orange has been within the family's holdings at some point over the last 800 years. It's not all been held all the time, and a lot of the land was not held directly by the family. That sounds a bit odd, but there are two ways of holding land in Scotland. The king would give the land to the earl. The earl then had two choices. He can either manage it directly and appoint a manager in each area to look after the tenants and collect the money for him, or he can what they call few the land. And that way he appoints someone else to look after it, and they have to pay him an annual few duty for the land. Now, in the vast scheme of things, that doesn't matter, but it does when you look at the archives. Where the Earl retains direct control, we generally have records of the transactions and the income from the estate. Where the land is feued, the only record that we'll have is the few duty being paid each year. So that means for those bits of the lands, we have no knowledge of who the people are who are living on the lands or what's happening on the land. All we know is that the few duty is paid. So it's an interesting one, and it's just worth remembering that. The picture on the left-hand side just emphasises the fact that although the Duke of Argyll today is very much located in Argyll, and all the lands that we now hold are in Argyll, in the past he had quite significant holdings in other parts of Scotland. So that map there, you can see Edinburgh, and then just to the west of Edinburgh you've got Stirling. And the Duke of Argyll had, well, there was Argyll's Lodging, which is a very old building just below Stirling Castle. And he also owned tenements and lands within the borough of Stirling as well. Over in Dollar was the heart of what was called the Regality of Campbell. And that included lands in Dollar and lands around in Clackmannanshire and Stirling and Perth and Fife. So quite an extensive set of lands, which also included some quite significant coal mines. So a really useful source of income. And those were held between round about 1600 and 1800. The arrow pointing to Bowness relates to a marriage of the 5th Duke. He married the Dowager Duchess of Hamilton. So she had been married to the Duke of Hamilton. He had died, and she then married the Duke of Argyll. Great, lovely. As part of her widow's portion, she was given control of some of the lands in Bowness, which she then brought to the Argyll estates when she married the Duke of Argyll. And so for that period of that marriage, those lands as well were managed from here. I would say that's not a huge length of time, but we do have some quite nice tenant records from Bowness and Kinneil from that period. When the Duchess died, the lands reverted to the Hamilton estate, just to make sure that the land, each family has to make sure it keeps its lands intact. And the other arrow there is to Edinburgh, where the Duke of Argyll, well, the Earl of Argyll originally had an apartment at Holyrood Palace. So right in the heart of government alongside the sovereign in the centre of Edinburgh. Okay, and the third reason that the collection is important is the chronological depth of the archive. And to illustrate that, what you can see on the screen is our earliest piece, which is a charter by Malcolm Earl of Fife, and one of our most recent acquisitions, which is a Lego model of Inveraray Castle that was made in 2021. just to show the vast difference in them. The earliest document in particular, I just love. It's actually very small. It's only about 8 inches by maybe 5 inches, but it's perfect. As you can see, there are no holes. It's all perfectly legible. All the wording is there, and the seal is still fully visible. It hasn't been damaged over the years, so it's a really lovely piece to have. Doesn't actually belong to the family. As you'll see, there's no Argyll in that caption, and it was bought at auction. There's an auction ticket on the back, and we reckon that one of the previous dukes wanted to add this to the collection because Malcolm, Earl of Fife, was one of those who would put the crown on the sovereign's head, and he would put the crown on the head of Alexander III. And we think possibly there was just a desire to possess this very important document that related to a very important person. So those are the 3 reasons why Alan MacInnes thinks this collection is particularly important: because of the family and their positions, because of the extent of the lands, and because we have that record that started back in the 1200s and is still being built today. So now we're going to turn our attention to some of the record series, and we're going to start in the medieval period, which I suspect probably most of us doing family history don't get back that far most of the time. But we do have quite an extensive collection of medieval writs and titles, as we call them. And these are the very formal record of special events and special things. So they're the record of the ownership of land, the marriage contract, which has to control exactly what the women of the family take with them to the wedding and what then comes back to the family when they die, or when their husbands die, or when their children inherit. We have exciting documents called bonds of friendship and man rent, which are about agreements to supply men at arms and boats or berlins in time of war, usually an agreement between a certain number of people against a common enemy, who couldn't be the king or the queen, of course. That would be treason. Few charters, which again is that record of land being given to someone else to manage in return for a duty every year. They do have names of witnesses, so it is possible that you may come across somebody who you were looking for. Quite often witnesses are minor nobility or even officials, clerks, ministers. Quite often their names quite often appear. The other thing that's quite useful about writs and titles is that land was very much, it was described in terms of the lands around it. So you can get often quite secondary information about not so much your bit of land or the bit of land that's described, but the land around it, or mention who owns those lands and where the boundaries are. And if it's in a town or a borough, then there may be descriptions about the type of use of the land, so whether it was a brewery or a shop or things like that. So there is interesting information in these, although most of them probably are not going to relate to what we might call ordinary people, for want of a better term. So the next series we're going to look at is, we're moving on to the 17th century. So as you'll know, in the medieval period, most of the writing was done on parchment. Vellum was a very popular one. So basically animal skin that's been treated. It's a great material for preservation. It lasts extremely well with very little care, essentially. But because it was quite expensive and the process to create it was quite long and tedious, and also very few people wrote in the medieval period. Most people who wrote were men of the church who'd been educated to do that, and they became household clerks and essentially did writing for the entire household. With the invention of paper, and in the UK, this was usually paper created from rags, which were soaked and recycled and then made into a finer material that could be written on. This turned out this was a lot cheaper than parchment. And more people were being educated to write. So you get a growth in the records that we have. There's more and more records, more things are being written down. And that means that there's more information about what's happening in the world and about the people who live in the world. And the examples I've picked are on the left. We've got a household account. It's very difficult to see on the screen, but this does include payments made to William Collins, who was the coachman, and Mr. Jackson, who was the tailor. So you are starting to get servants, businessmen, commercial people being mentioned in the records. And on the right-hand side, we've got quite an early rental, as we would call it. And this is a list of people living in the old town of Inveraray by the bridge and on the fisherland. So some of them were fishermen. This is just the start of the list. There are actually quite a lot more. So these are the people who were paying rent for their property. And their names get mentioned. And this is from 1688. So that's really quite early to get a list of people who are actually living in the town. In a rental, you'll also quite often get a record of payments made to people who did particular things. So often the ministers get paid, teachers, payments will be mentioned, postmen or post boys, and also the hangman often comes in for a payment. So if your ancestors ever held any of those roles, then they might well appear even at this early stage. And the 17th century financial records are becoming much more available. There's so many more of them being produced. So financial records, well, you get the full accounts, but beyond that, you get numerous bills and receipts, which actually are usually on tiny little scraps of paper. They may be, just a couple of inches by 6 inches or something, and the writing can be written very small and squashed into that piece of paper. But these are written for payments that are made to everybody for anything they do. So it could be gardening, it could be haymaking, it could be laundry. So really quite ordinary people who are delivering a service to the family. Because they're scraps of paper, they can be quite easily overlooked, and some of them have become damaged over the years just because they were so small and fine. The other thing about them is that you wrote the initial bill that said, this person needs to be paid. And then when the person received their payment, they signed or they made their mark. And on this one, you can see down at the bottom, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but down here, you've got Donald McIlhonnell's mark. So he couldn't write, but he's made his mark on that page, which is his way of signing it. So it's a really useful thing to be aware of, because there are, normal people here that you can actually track and trace. It's also, we have now a growth in legal papers. And this example is, it's a record called a judicial rental. And this one in particular was, I don't know how much you know about Scottish history in the 17th century, but it was a pretty tumultuous time. And towards the end of the century, there had been various battles and invasions, and a lot of the Earl of Argyll's lands had been taken over by the Earl of Montrose. And at the end of the century, there was this huge legal business trying to sort out who should get the rents for what bits of the land. Most of it did come back to the Argyll family, but there were, copious sort of court cases trying to work out the value. And a judicial rental is when the tenant turns up in court and has to swear on the Bible that this is the value of their property, because this is the rent that they've paid every year for the last how many years. And some of those tenants could be quite small landholders. They didn't need to be big, important people. They just held a portion of land. The millers, the farmers, are people living in the area. Other legal papers include things like bonds, where someone agrees to loan money and you give them a guarantee that it'll be paid back. We have more wills and testaments, although not so many actually in the archive here. And there's also a start of some personal correspondence, although I would say that most of the correspondence in this collection relates directly to the Earls of Argyll. So it's not usually about normal people, ordinary people. Sorry, it sounds terrible. I don't like calling them ordinary or normal, but you'll know what I mean. Not the aristocracy, basically, is what I'm meaning. We also have some really interesting surveys for the 17th century. And the one I'm showing, well, the part of the one I'm showing you on the screen, this is from Lochhead, which is now Campbellton in Kintyre. And this was a survey made in 1653. So the Earl of Argyll had been given Kintyre in 1607. Previous to that, it was essentially it was managed by the MacDonalds, and the king decided that they were a bit too much troublemaker and not enough good manager of the land. So he decided to give it to the Earl of Argyll instead to manage. Some say this is the real source of what happened at Glencoe in, many years later, was that all of his land being taken from MacDonald's and given to Campbell's. Who knows? We weren't there. But it is a fascinating record because actually, again, it's listing the people who are paying their rent. And if you can read the hand, you'll be able to see that Thomas Gillis, the gardener, and Donald McNeill, alias Donald Crondew, what they're paying for their houses and yards. And then there's Archibald McNabb, Thomas Campbell, some really interesting spellings of Campbell around as well, Thomas Weir. So there's, this type of document is full of names again of people. So if you're trying to find people who lived in this area, then, they may not appear in a record like this, but if they do, that's sort of pretty gold dust really to actually find them, be able to see where they were and what they were paying for their land. Yeah. So our legal papers continue into the early 18th century. And this is we've got two 18th century court books, one for the regality of Campbell, which is that area around Dollar that I mentioned when we were looking at the map. And the other one is for an area of Argyll called Craignish, which is over on the west coast of the mainland, not far below Oban. So we've got these two early 18th century court books, which again are absolutely full of people, because these are ordinary people who are pursuing their neighbours for debt, for their cutting down their woods illegally, for trespassing on their land, for stealing their sheep. This is people looking for justice, which was dispensed in it's now the Duke of Argyll. He's become the Duke in 1701. So in the Duke of Argyll's court. We only have these two early court books and a few miscellaneous records before that. And that's partly because after the Battle of Culloden in 1746, one of the reactions from the government was to remove the inherited judicial powers of landowners like the Duke of Argyll. They decided that legal system and the system of justice needed to be more independent, and it therefore becomes more of a government designed court system rather than a local landlord system. But again, lots of people in these records. And moving into the 18th century, our records of estate administration really take off during the 1700s. This was a period across Scotland of what they called agricultural improvement, which at the heart was about improving the quality and the income from the land. So there was lots of learning about how you maintain land by, moving crops around, so you're not doing the same thing with it all the time, by giving ground resting time in between different crops, better ways to manage livestock and husbandry, ways to breed better quality cattle and things like that. And that move actually led to a huge increase in the records created through the process. So this particular volume is from the Chamberlain's accounts. So for the Argyll estates, there was a Chamberlain who managed the whole estate on behalf of the Duke, and he was based at Inveraray, where his office was. And then around those other parts of the land that we looked at on the map, there were smaller, they were sometimes called chamberlains and sometimes called factors, and they managed the land on his behalf further afield. And they had to come back every year, they had to bring their records and they had to bring their accounts and they had to explain what they had been doing and, you know, what was happening in their part of the country. So the records we have for these, they're mostly in volumes, some of them rather large and quite heavy volumes, but they are mostly in volumes. And it's this summary of information that's coming from all different parts of the estate. And they include lots of ordinary people, people who have done different jobs, not hugely important. Well, they are hugely important jobs. They're not important people per se. They could be somebody who's cutting down trees or building fences or gardening. But you suddenly get, you know, this much greater knowledge about the people who are working on the land and who are involved. As is probably the case with many archives, our account books are not indexed in any way, which is both wonderful and a real pain. So if you're looking for somebody, you do have to look carefully through every page of the book. But that's also really quite exciting because you find things that you hadn't anticipated finding, and you find sort of weird and wonderful payments that you just wouldn't quite have managed. I think one of the things that I found when I first came and I was looking at these books is I'd never really thought about the fact that in olden times there were no pensions as such, you know, there was no government pension. But actually the Earls and Dukes of Argyll did really well actually giving money. They gave pensions and annuities to people in the town who were poverty struck. You get references to people who are blind or needs, you know, specific support. And, you know, they are very helpfully giving people money like that. So there's a whole area of sort of people's names that appear, which you don't necessarily expect. And with the agricultural improvements, the way that land is tenanted changes as well. So this is an example of an earlier farmship rental. So most of Scotland's agriculture was organised in farms or tenancies that were multi people involved in that. So you had a whole group of tenants. So I think if you can see in this one, we've got Hector MacPhail and Alexander Campbell and Donald MacPhail, John MacDonald, Neil Campbell. You know, there's a whole group of people and everyone who was part of that agreement for a large piece of land. And then each year they would share it out between them. And there were different ways of doing that. Some areas they drew lots, other areas they just discussed and decided. Sometimes they had a sort of rota because obviously there were better bits of land and it wouldn't be fair if the same person had the better land all the time. So one of the things that came about during the agricultural improvement was that these joint tenancies change into individual tenancies. And so you get a growth of everyone having their own piece of land, their own croft, their own space. And they were usually for longer periods as well. And part of the logic behind that was that if you're going to ask people to improve their land, they've got to have a vested interest in benefiting from the improvement. And if they've only got it for a year and then somebody else is going to be farming it next year, why on earth would they bother? So it's a fascinating changeover from these joint tenancies to individual tenancies. With all of these rentals and leases, there would be a paper copy that the tenants got to take away with them. There would be a local copy with the Earl or the Chamberlain's local representative. And then there is a copy in volumes, many of which have survived in the archive here. So this copy has been taken out of a volume which is full of these copy agreements with the tenants. So another part of agricultural improvement is actually about surveying the land. Now, that could be, as it was in many cases, a land survey. So they would go out and they would assess the quality of the land. Surveyors would come and they'd draw up often very, very beautiful plans of what the land looked like. And they would often provide a written description of the acreage and what people are growing and how they manage it, and what's being done. We do have one from Tyree from the 1768-69, which includes a fascinating introduction, just talking about how the tenants could do so much better if only they would focus on what they were meant to be doing and not concentrate on whiskey production. So, but alongside the land surveys, there are also people surveys. And this example on the screen here is from what we call the census of Argyll from 1779. And in this volume, the local representatives listed all the people who were working on the Duke of Argyll's land. So it doesn't include parts of the area that were being viewed that someone else was managing. This is all people who were working directly for the Duke. But what's really fab about it is that you get the farm name or the name of the croft, and then you get a name of the people living on that croft. So you've got the head of the household, you've got his age, and then his wife and her age. And then if there are children, the children will be listed too. And if you look at this one here for Barvrak, you'll see that they also had here a dairymaid, a couple of dairymaids. So they get listed too with their ages. I would say that you have to take their ages with a pinch of salt because people didn't celebrate their birthdays in the same way that we do now. So you'll probably know this from census records and other people records. You have to allow a margin of error for people getting it wrong. But hugely fascinating detail. And in Scotland, our first official census was not until 1841. So this can take people back a whole extra 60 years in one document, which is really fabulous. The one for Tyree from 1776 is also fascinating. And I'll just tell you this, I haven't got a picture of it here, because I think at that point they were starting to think about how they were going to divide up these multi-tenanted townships into individual crofts. And so they actually made really careful notes about what people were like. So they would say how many horses or cows they had. They mention whether somebody has a drink problem or whether he doesn't pay his rent. So you get this whole extra bit of information, which really brings the people alive and makes you feel like, you actually know who they were. So they're fabulous records. So we've got one for Tyree for 1776. We've got this one from 1779 that covers most of Argyll. And we've also got one for Kintyre for 1792 and another one for Tyree in 1792. I'm not sure why Tyree got so many different ones, but they're just lucky. And there are other sort of fairly random lists of people which that you just come across and you just have to find them. This one lists people in Campbellton, in the Landward parish of Campbellton, as they call it. And basically they've got all the names of the people and where they're living. And then they're noting whether or not they're Highlanders or Lowlanders, which, excuse me, in this context means whether they go to the Gaelic church, the Highland church, or whether they go to the English church. It just, it's a fairly random thing, and we do have odd bits and pieces like this that come up and you just go, oh, that's fab. It just gives you a whole, other vision of what was happening at the time. Now, as you would expect, we've got a very big collection of records relating to the building of Inveraray Castle in the 18th century. And a lot of that is plans and instructions, which are fabulous and really interesting, particularly if you're interested in the castle and its construction, or if you're visiting the castle and you want to know more about it. And they're used a lot. But the records also include really lots of detail about the people involved in the process of building. So we've got masons and carpenters and quarriers. Often they're listed, they're paid wages, they write receipts and bills. So there is a huge amount of information there that can be dug into, and which might produce evidence of people living here in the past that might be of use. And military papers. So the majority of our military papers date from before 1707. So in 1707, the parliaments of Scotland and England united, and essentially the parliament moved down to London. And at that point, things like the army and the navy were managed from London. So the vast majority of official military records from 1707 are held in the National Archives at Kew in London. It's always worth bearing that in mind. They're not in Scotland, and they're definitely not here. But we do have a fairly extensive collection of papers from before 1707. The Earl of Argyll, as were many nobles, were tasked with raising regiments to do certain actions, and so we do have details of the actions and of some of the people being raised. We have kit lists and stock lists and how they're going to feed them and keep them on the road, and details like that. The actual lists of people in the militia, we have a few of those, but the majority are in the National Exchequer record, which is in Edinburgh. So even from this period, we won't have all of those. But we do have these wonderful bits and pieces, like the document on the left, where these gentlemen were recruited in 1759 on Tyree. Alongside this particular document, there's also a bill for the whiskey that was bought. I suspect it was to encourage people to join up. So yeah, there are sort of stories like that hidden in. And on the right there, we've got the order of battle at Culloden. So that's actually twice the original document is twice that size. There's no point trying to put it all on the screen because it would be illegible. And this is the government side, because the Argylls fought on the government side with the Duke of Cumberland. On the other side, it has the order of battle of the clans as well. So we have all of these sort of, information about, it's not many people in that one, but there is quite a lot of information in the recruiting. Beyond 1707, there were voluntary regiments that were raised from time to time. And we have documents that relate to the training of those people, sort of turning out to do a bit of practice, kitting them, informal battalions and regiments that are created for different purposes. So when Queen Victoria visited Inveraray in 1875, they actually created a whole new group of guards to sort of give her an entrance to the castle. They created new uniforms and and gave them weapons and things like that, which hadn't existed before. And then going into the 20th century, we have the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, and the family were often colonels of the regiment, honorary colonels. They didn't get paid for it or anything. It was a prestige thing, and so the family was still quite involved with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, well, up until probably the Second World War. So the 10th Duke at the beginning of the 20th century had quite a collection of letters and photographs from people serving on the front. And we do have records of, of that. And particularly, I think they raised a memorial for the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, particularly at Beaumont Hamel after the war. And the family were instrumental in helping to pay for that, and in the service that sort of dedicated it to the troops who had died. So we do have military papers, but not a consistent record all the way through. It's a lot of luck in these ones, I'm afraid. And this is an example of a 19th century rental. So we looked at the multi-tenancy rental earlier on. We had the picture of the one from the 18th century. this style of rental started in the 19th century and continued well up into, I think the latest ones I've got that are written like this are from the 1950s. So it's an established pattern for a long time. It gives the farm or the tenancy name and the name of the tenant, and then it lists the payments that have been made, and often it lists the arrears or the debt that are owed by the tenant as well. Quite often you'll find broader family references. There were occasions when a family member would bail somebody out and pay the rent for them. Sometimes you get somebody has died, and so their name is crossed out, and then their wife or their brother's name or their son's name is written into the space to show that they've taken over the tenancy. So you do get lots of bits of information that you don't necessarily expect. Towards the end of the 19th century, we had the Napier Commission, which was a big inquiry into the rents that people were paying and whether or not tenants had a fair case when they said that they were being hard done by. And after that Napier Commission evidence has all been published. So that's all available through libraries. But it does give you very detailed evidence from individual tenants. So these are not huge, big, important people. They're just the people on the ground who are paying the rent. And beyond that, we then have the Crofting Commission, who were established to make sure that rents continued to be fairly applied. And so they collected evidence of rents that people were paying. They assess them, and then they determine on fair rents. And at the beginning of the 20th century, they also start to have a really big part in deciding how land should be divided up if a tenant leaves their tenancy. So, it ceases to be all down to the landowner. The Crofting Commission has quite a big say in what's going on and how much people can be charged for it. We continue to have household papers in the 19th century. We have journals and ledgers, which are essentially account books. They include payments to staff very frequently. Quite often individual payments, like the ones you can see in front of you. So we've got Isabella Stewart, who was working in the castle, and May MacArthur, who brought faggots, and Catherine, who was working in the laundry. So we do, we have individual ones there, but also frustratingly, quite often there'll be payments made to housemaids or dairymaids without any indication of who those people actually were. You just get a sum, which can be very frustrating. You just have to hope that the person you're looking for has been in that volume that was being kept by someone who actually wrote them all down separately. We have a few early photographs, not very many. The lady on the screen there is Kingy, who was the governess to the family children. I'm not sure if she was very happy about having her photo taken, but there you go. The other thing we have starting to come in towards the end of the 19th century is that we have vouchers, which are sort of individual summaries of payments to a particular supplier or to a particular employee. So those include much more direct and personal information than the ledgers. But the survival, we have a lot of them, largely uncatalogued yet, I'm afraid, but we do have a lot of them. But if we do have one for somebody you're interested in, it has a lot more information because it will cover every payment to them and give you an idea of what they were doing and how long they were doing it for. So definitely sources to think about. And the 19th century also sees a sort of major takeoff in personal papers. Correspondence, huge boost in the 19th century, but also diaries. And there's a diary on the screen here that you can see which belonged to the 8th Duchess. And she kept a fairly detailed diary, particularly when she was staying in Kintyre. So the 8th Duke and the Duchess spent most of their lives living in London, but every year they came up to their estates in Scotland. And the 8th Duke was a bit of a micromanager anyway. He was very interested in the estate, how it was run, and his correspondence shows that he had a detailed knowledge of what was happening, who was there, what they were doing, how things were going. The 8th Duchess, when she writes in her diaries, when she was in Scotland, she would visit farms and people, and she would include information about them in her diary. So quite often she refers to houses that she felt were not of a suitable quality, people who needed physical help, where they needed schools, or where a nurse would be useful. And you get this sort of bigger picture of what it was like, which really helps. It helps both with a picture of the area, but also, if it's your family who then get mentioned, I mean, that's just fabulous information to have. And from the diary's point of view, our biggest series is actually the 10th Duke of Argyll series. So the 10th Duke is the one on the right there, and that's his sister who's standing beside him. So this is Neil Diarmaid Campbell, who was the 10th Duke of Argyll. He succeeded in 1914, and he was Duke until he died in 1948-49. And he kept a diary. So the earliest diaries we have for him are from 1890 and 1891. And then we've got a gap. And then they start again in 1899. And then we have the entire series from 1899 up until 1947. Duke Neil, these are tiny little diaries. They're literally sort of, quarter of this, half the size of a paperback book. With a page to a day. He wrote copious amounts of information in them in his tiny little handwriting. He wrote about what he was doing, where he was and how he got there, who he was meeting. And quite often these are, because he's a Duke of Argyll, he is quite often meeting important people and having dinner with, lords and ladies and things. But he also spent much of his time in Inveraray, traveling around his estate. He was interested in the planting and the woodland management. He knew the people who lived and worked on his estate, and he went out and he talked to them, and then he recorded that in his diary. So again, a whole heap of fascinating information about people who otherwise you might not find very much about in the records. So I would say that we have a surprisingly small photograph collection here. Most of our 19th century photographs are family only, and many of those are unidentified family members. It's not really until the 20th century that we start to get normal people pictured in our photographs. And this is just a couple of examples. So this is a chap who was a houseboy in the castle at the beginning of the Second World War on the left. And then on the right, we've got the gardener and his wife in one of the hothouses where they were growing vines. And that was sort of in the 1930s, 1940s period. So they are lovely when you get them, but as I say, we don't have a huge number of photographs, so it's a bit hit or miss. So another section of the records I need to mention, because they just have such an amazing content, is the Argyll Synod Papers. So the Church of Scotland runs on every church has a presbytery, and then for every area of Scotland, you then have a synod, and each presbytery will send its minister and potentially other representatives to the synod. Because they're Church of Scotland records, the formal records, the formal minute books and journals and things all belong to the Church of Scotland and have largely been deposited in National Records of Scotland. What we have here is the paperwork that went behind that. So the clerk would get sent the letters, and then somebody's apologies would be noted in the minutes of the meeting. So it was, it's very much the informal letter coming in saying, I can't be at synod because And there are some amazing sub-stories about why people can't turn up now and again. People are either very creative or had very interesting lives, I think. But there's lots of information about appointing ministers, training and appointing teachers, because the church was quite often funded teacher training, church and school buildings, because again, the church was responsible for both education and providing buildings for schools and worship. There was a huge problem in what was essentially a Gaelic-speaking area in recruiting Gaelic-speaking ministers. And where there were good Gaelic-speaking ministers, there's frequently quite a lot of correspondence with different churches fighting for that minister because they all want that minister. There's actually a really lovely letter. I think it was sent back from North America. I can't remember exactly where off the top of my head, where they needed a Gaelic minister in North America. And they write back to the Argyll Synod to see whether or not they can help them with that. And there's lots of petitions for financial support, quite often widows of ministers or just people who have hit really hard times. There's one petition from a lady who's been in agony because she has had a 7-inch gallstone, which I can't even imagine, just sounds really awful. And then, somebody who had gone to North America with her husband as a minister, and then he's died, and she's managed to get back to Britain and then to Scotland, but has not a penny to her name and 5 children to look after. And, so amazing personal stories that come up that, again, you have to be lucky. It has to be the person you're looking for. But if it is, they're absolutely fabulous. So as I said, some of our records have been published, not a huge number, and mostly but the ones that have been published are quite people heavy. So we've got the census that I mentioned from 1779, which was published by the Scottish Record Society, and then the census for Kintyre in 1792, which has also been published by the Scottish Record Society, different editors. Inhabitants of the Inner Isles, Morven and Ardnamurchan from 1716. Argyll Estate Instructions. So these were issued by the 5th Duke, who was another one of the dukes who was particularly interested in promoting agricultural improvement on his land. And he was also very much of a micromanager. So his instructions are very detailed. He knows a lot about what's going on all over his estate, and he knows about people, the people who are doing well, the people who are not, and he's quite clear about that in his instructions about who's to be got rid of, who's to be kept on, who's to be rewarded. And these instructions are issued to his local representative to take action on the ground. So again, lots of people in those. And similarly for Kintyre, we have a published volume of the Kintyre instructions as well. Not a huge amount published. There may be more actually, which I just don't know about yet, because there's no record in the archive of what has been published. It's more a case of when I come across it, I go, oh, that's ours. And then I find out more about it. So thank you very much for listening. And this is my contact details. So that's the email address, and you are very, very welcome to write with any queries you have after this. Of course, I'm hoping you'll have questions while I'm here, but sometimes it takes a little bit more time. I mentioned at the beginning that I'm trying to bring order to chaos and create a catalogue of the collection. Our first steps, and they are baby steps at the moment, are available at www.argyll-papers.com. Do go and have a look and see what we're trying to do. As I say, it is a tiny proportion of the collection that is currently available that way, but we are working really hard to make more available, and keep an eye on it because it will grow as we get things done. And thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you. We do have a few questions for you, so we can get into those. Let's see here. So the first one is, are there any unique naming patterns or customs that help in identifying those family connections in Argyll?
There are family names in different areas, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can make the jump between the name that you're looking for and the names in those areas. As with all Gaelic speaking areas, there was a big move after the 18th century or during the 18th century to move from Gaelic to English names as well, because the Gaelic names just became politically sort of difficult. And some of those changes can really muddy the water as well, because you're not quite sure. Sometimes it was a name that meant something similar, and sometimes it was just a name that sounded right. I was looking at someone's family tree the other day, and I was looking for a particular surname, and I found a whole family area, a whole load of them down in Kintyre, but I can't tie the two together. So at the moment I've got a list of names that I'm looking for, and I've got a list of names with that family, but until I can actually make that connection, that evidence connection, I can't actually join them up. Beyond that, I think the naming patterns in the Highlands were fairly, people didn't always stick to it, but often you named the eldest child after, the eldest boy was named after the father, and the eldest daughter was named after the mother, and then you've got the father's father and the mother's mother, and they followed the similar patterns to everybody else, I think. And if a child died, they often named another child with the same name, which can be really quite confusing when you're trying to distinguish who's who and where they've gone. And there are some very odd names as well. But you just have to take it. But I think so. Yes, there are patterns. I think it's always difficult. And one of the problems of estate records, which are a lot of what we've got, is that generally only the head of the household or the person paying the rent is actually named. So, for example, at any one time in Inveraray, there might have been, 5 people called Archibald Campbell who are paying the rent on different farms. So you need quite a lot of contextual information to be able to work out which one is yours and which one is not. Bits like the census are really helpful in just giving you that bit of content, but that's like a snapshot of 1779. So it doesn't go before or after. So it can be tricky, but you just have to hope that you get the one where they've crossed out the name of the man when he died and his wife's taken over, or hope that the brother's there or the sons come into the record, and then you'll get a bit more.
Helpful, thank you. Let's see. Our next one is, are there any specific DNA projects focused on families from Argyll that you're aware of currently?
There's 2 that I'm aware of. One is Clan Campbell, surprise, surprise. They've got a big DNA project, which is managed by the Clan Campbell Society of North America. And the other one I'm aware of is a McDougall project, which is running. And I can't remember the name of the person who's looking after that, but I could look that up. If somebody wanted to drop me an email, I could probably give them a name. So if for either of those, I could give you a contact to speak to. And then if those names are familiar, I'm not aware of any others, but there probably are.
Thank you. So it looks like we have one more question. And before we get to that, I just wanted to mention if anybody would like copy of the chat, or if you have any additional questions, please send us an email at genealogy@acpl.info. And so for our last question, it is, how are the Synod papers different from the Kirk sessions regarding those seeking financial support or help?
Oh, difficult, because I haven't actually sat and compared what I've got with the Kirk session minutes. So if you think about taking a meeting today, you don't write down every single word that people say. You're writing down a précis of the proceedings. And I think that's what you get in the Kirk session minutes. So I think the fundamental information will be similar. But in the letter that was actually written about, what was going on, you may get additional material. I would also say that the Kirk session minutes, I know that lots of them are available online, but we don't have them here. You know, you've got to go into Scotland's People or find them online. Whereas these, we actually have the bits of paper and we can actually pick them up, turn them around, handle them, love them, smell them, you know, all of that. So, you know, it's part of the experience and it is really lovely. So I think probably the substance is probably a duplicate, but we may have additional bits of information that come with the actual original petition or letter.
Thank you. So again, if anybody has any questions that pop up afterwards, please feel free to send us an email. genealogy@acpl.info is our email address. So thank you to everybody for attending, and thank you, Alison, for presenting. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was lovely. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.